Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Martha C. Nussbaum, who is a philosopher and Ernest Freund Distinguished Service Professor of Law and Ethics at the University of Chicago. She is on the Berkeley campus to deliver the 2006-07 Forster Lectures. Professor Nussbaum has made significant contributions to an array of disciplines, working within the fields of philosophy, law, classics, and political science. She has advanced the interdisciplinary study of ongoing problems in areas such as cognition and emotions, feminism, democracy, religion, and education, among others. Some of her publications include Upheavals of Thought, The Intelligence of Emotions, Cultivating Humanity, A Classical Defense of Reform of Liberal Education, The Fragility of Goodness, Luck and Ethics in Greek Tragedy and Philosophy, and Women and Human Development, The Capabilities Approach. Professor Nussbaum, welcome to Berkeley.
Thanks very much, Harry. It's really great to be here.
Where were you born and raised?
Well, I was born in New York City, but then soon after that we moved to suburban Philadelphia. So I grew up on what was called the Main Line in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
Well, you know, I didn't really like Bryn Mawr. I thought it was elitist and snobbish, and so I got an interest in breaking out of that and looking at the wider world and thinking about inequalities of race and class and so on. But also, in a more positive way, my father was a very determined, hard-working person who had actually brought his way up from poverty to be a partner in a big law firm. And he was a tremendous influence because he loved to work hard, and he thought you should get the maximum out of whatever abilities you had. And so he just taught me, never let down, and just always get the most out of whatever you're doing.
And your mother?
My mother was a very unhappy woman. She had given up a career as an interior decorator, and she was very bored and unhappy, and she was a very loving woman, and I feel that she was a great source of love and emotion. In fact, once I wrote a philosophical dialogue that my parents figure in, and she's the one who speaks for the emotions. But I also learned that women who are forced to give up their careers don't always have happy lives, and that was important to me.
Before you take off to college, what in your training, your education, made you think that you might want to be a philosopher, or did that only come later?
Well, I went to this very intense feminist school where we thought a lot about ideas, and I had great, great teachers. I didn't call it philosophy at the time. I thought about literature, but I wrote about Dostoevsky, I wrote about Shakespeare, you know, and I was thinking about a lot of the same issues that I think about now, about emotions and vulnerability. I was also reading Greek tragedies. So, you know, it was very continuous with what I'm doing now, but I just didn't hear the word philosophy very much. And actually not for a long time, because, you know, I first went to graduate school in classical literature, and I switched to philosophy only during graduate school.
Mm-hmm. And were you a debater, just out of curiosity, as a young person?
No, I was an actress.
An actress?
I did a lot of acting, and I wanted to be a professional actress, and I actually was. In 2 summers and then 1 whole year, I did professional repertory theater acting, and it was only when I realized that I really wanted to think about the plays and not to act in them that I went back to regular school and finished undergraduate school. But I got a lot out of that, and I still enjoy, you know, performing my own scripts. But as a lecturer, you can write the script yourself.
And your admirable style as a lecturer really comes out, and this may point us into an understanding of how that came about.
Well, and you know, in teaching, I always try very hard to dramatize the philosophical issue, to make it seem like a real human problem that people are actually worried about, because I think philosophy can seem to undergraduates very dry, but it isn't. I mean, it's the most urgent questions about human life, and so I feel some dramatic ability helps when you try to bring that out.
And so as an undergraduate, you majored in theater arts and then literature? Is that what your path here?
Well, you know, I was in the School of the Arts for 1 year at NYU.
At NYU, yeah.
Yeah, and then when I went back to regular school. I mean, so I'd left Wellesley for this acting job. I went to NYU School of the Arts. Then I just went back and I majored in classics, actually. And then I went on to graduate school at Harvard in classics, but very quickly got into the philosophical side of it, because that was where the excitement was right then at Harvard.
And was that because of the instruction you were getting, or it was just what drew you, what really attracted you?
Well, you know, the people who were teaching tragedy were not really intellectually challenging, and they weren't interested in the ideas in it. And G.E.L. Owen, this great scholar who worked on Plato and Aristotle, he was challenging and exciting. And so it was the whole circle around Owen that was very rigorous, very challenging. And so I got into that circle, but I still felt that there was something talking about emotions, talking about ethical issues that was missing there. And when Bernard Williams came to Harvard to teach for a year, then I saw that that's possible to do that within philosophy. And that's what I really wanted to do. I mean, what I wanted to do was not to talk about these things in the way that a classical scholar did, just editing the text or whatever was being done at the time. I wanted to talk about the philosophical issues, about moral dilemmas, about the emotions, and so on. So Williams gave me a tremendous sense of possibility and permission, in the sense that if he could do that within philosophy, then it could be done within philosophy. At the time, it was tough, because people, if you talked about emotions or even about friendship, especially if you were a woman, they thought, oh, you softy, you know, you're not really a philosopher. But Williams was an iconoclast, and because he was so respected, he gave other people permission to follow and do that.
So this would have been in the 70s, so it was an ideal time for a woman to be entering philosophy and raising these issues. Is that a fair statement, or was it still a struggle?
Well, it was a struggle. And I actually have written a piece for a volume of memoirs of women in philosophy. I think there were a lot of problems about sexual harassment, and I certainly encountered that. There were a lot of problems about childcare. I had a child when I was only 25, when I was in my third year of graduate school. No one knew what to do about that. All the department colloquia were held at just the hour when the child care centers closed, and no one understood that. So I felt that I was the first one kind of blazing the trail for these issues, and it was very, very tough. I was tired a lot of the time, and I did encounter a tremendous amount of discrimination, but probably less than other women at other places, because I think some of the people at Harvard, like Hilary Putnam, John Rawls, and so on, were extremely fair-minded and great voices for women. So was Bernard Williams. Long before there was the term sexual harassment, he was telling women to protest when men on the faculty harassed them.
Our program goes out to a general audience, and I wonder if I could ask you a kind of a naive question here, which is, what does a philosopher do? Help us understand what that's all about.
Well, I think philosophy has only some unity. I mean, philosophers do many, many different things. But if I just stick with moral and political philosophy, I think that there are some very general questions about the basis of the moral life, where laying it out in a reasoned way can actually help us. I mean, it starts from Socrates. Socrates thought that if you didn't examine your ethical beliefs, then you probably were just a mess. I mean, you were inconsistent, and that meant you could be self-serving. You could do what you felt like and rationalize it some way. But if you really examined your beliefs, then you had to put yourself on a short leash. And if you said that you were all for X, well, you had to do that consistently. And so I think, in our moral lives, one of the great problems is this kind of self-serving partiality, where we think, oh, well, yes, of course that's a rule, but it applies to other people and not to me. Or, we don't even think that far. So philosophizing gives you a set of, as it were, guidelines and guardrails. It won't be any good if you don't start with basically healthy ethical convictions. I don't think philosophy can conduct a radical reform. So that's why I think the feminist movement couldn't have much role for philosophy until it had already progressed a certain distance through a kind of radical evangelizing and consciousness raising. But then once that happens, it's good to lay it out more systematically and say, where are we now, and how can we actually be fully fair and inclusive and get the best out of our convictions. So I think what a philosopher does is just try to think through the convictions and think through in a more rigorous and systematic way, which sometimes can involve quite elaborate and formal kinds of reasoning, but not always. And then often what that shows you is that a certain area that is calling out for attention has not actually been well addressed. Mm-hmm. And so I think you always have to be responsive also to the world and the new problems in it. I mean, I've just now been writing about global justice, and I think that, theories of justice up until recently did okay when they're talking about a single nation, but they didn't really think very well about the larger world and the different kinds of institutions that are in it, the role of multinational corporations, the role of international agencies. So you have to know something about the world also and care about that.
What you said you've covered so many important areas in your work, which we can't all cover in this hour. But I'm curious, help us understand the synergies involved in your picking your agenda at particular times. Is it, events in the world? Is it your background? Is it your readings? Is there something that you could tell us about that?
Well, I think if the work is going to be good, it has to come from someplace deep in you. And in my case, I think the driving issue is human vulnerability and trying to understand what that means for the conduct of life. The fact that we are such that we can be robbed of the things we love most in an instant, and that if we're going to plan for a life, we just don't know whether that plan can be carried out. I mean, that plan has preoccupied philosophers over the ages, and not surprisingly, but it's what got me going, and I wanted to think about the emotions because I think of them as our ways of registering how things are with our uncertain projects out there in the world, our attachments to people beyond our control. But then also that led me to political philosophy, because, all right, here are people who are more vulnerable than they should be because they don't have enough food, they don't have enough health care. And surely one of the main jobs of political arrangements is to bring the things people need more securely within their control. And of course you don't want a life in which you control everything, because that would be a life without love and a life without friendship. But a life in which you have enough to eat, drink, and in which certain central goods are securely guaranteed to you by the society that you live in. That, I think, is a reasonable expectation. Now, I got to that in my mind, but I was also catapulted into it by events, because I came with the economist Amartya Sen. I think you've interviewed him, and he won the Nobel Prize in 1998. I came to co-author a paper with him to a UN institute in Helsinki, which was a World Institute for Development Economics Research, and then I saw how fascinating and how urgent and compelling the problems of developing countries were, particularly problems of women and their inequalities, and I just became a research advisor at that institute, and I stayed there talking to people from lots of different countries, and for 10 years I did that kind of work 1 month every year and to learn about the world. So that kind of immersion in an international institute was very, very crucial for me.
Let me show this book. So it's one of the many that you've written, but we will be talking about it, and you just touched on it, Women and Human Development, the Capabilities Approach, and it probably is a good focal point as our discussion proceeds. And this book drew you in a way, metaphorically, I guess I could say, it drew you away from the library, because you really had to go into the field and encounter the lives of women, as you went to India on several trips and traveled there and lived there and so on. Talk a little about that, because one of the points you're making is that experience of women's rights and being denied rights that you experienced, that we just talked about in graduate school, was very different when you come to a developing place like India.
Yeah, well, I saw already at the Institute that I was very ignorant, that my education had been very bad because it was only a Western education. And so I started trying to learn about conditions in other countries, and I went to India. But when I was going to write this book, I thought, well, I don't want to pull in one example from China and one example from Iran and so on, but I want to get to know one country pretty well, because I think that only when you understand these issues that people are fighting for in their historical and regional context can you say anything reasonable. Well, I already loved India, and I've been more and more drawn into India all the time. So I said to an activist, a friend of mine, please help me, I mean, she works in India, please help me learn and just set me up with an itinerary where I can go around and meet with women's groups all over the country and see what women are really fighting for. And what I found was that, of course, the issues are continuous with issues that feminists talk about in the U.S. Sexual harassment, domestic violence, or adequate rape law. These are big issues, but they're also quite other issues that we don't think so much about because maybe we take them for granted, like girls being able to go to school, girls being able not to be married at age 6, girls being able to have some access to employment opportunities, being able to have equal property rights. And so these things are very connected with the others, because in fact one main way that women can stand up to their husbands against domestic violence is by having a job, so that the husband knows that they can exit if they want to. They can take that money out of the household. And also by having land. If they have land, then he knows she can go, and then I'm losing. So to think about the interconnections of all those issues was very, very important, because I think you just can't even have an adequate proposal in one of these areas unless you see the whole layout and how the problems are mesh together. Also to see a different political culture, because I think a lot of Americans think, oh, thriving Western democracies, but actually to me, India is a much more thriving democracy, because there's a great deal more voter turnout. The rural poor are very invested in politics. Gandhi set up rural village councils that bring people into the political process, even if they can't read and write. They get very involved in shaping the nation and often decide the results of elections. So I like the Indian democracy. I like people's passion for justice. When I would go to the poorest places, women were not just moaning and groaning. They were really making plans. They were excited about what they were doing, and they would, often sing songs and use the arts to dramatize their optimism.
Mm-hmm. And so how did this experience and this thinking, in what way did it lead to a formulation, and what is that formulation that you emphasize capabilities?
Yes, okay, let me tell you what that idea means. And it's actually something that Sen had been working on already before, and I developed it in a more philosophical way. But the international agencies, when they looked at countries in the old days, they used to ask just one question. That is, how's the economy doing? How much growth is there? And they would measure that by looking at the gross national product per capita. Well, you can see that if you're really trying to find out how people are doing and what their quality of life is, that's very crude, because it doesn't even look at distribution, and it would typically give very high marks to nations like South Africa under apartheid that had huge inequalities. It also doesn't identify and separate the different aspects of a human life: health, education, bodily integrity. All these things are separate. And you might have a nation, for example, the United States, that does pretty well on some of these indicators, but does very badly on domestic violence. So you want to look at each one of these separately. And so the idea of capabilities is that you ask the question, what are people actually able to do and to be? And then what I've done that Sen doesn't do is I specify 10 central things that I think are central indicators that any decent society would make quite pivotal and would guarantee to all citizens up to an adequate threshold level. So I look at life, health, bodily integrity, development of senses, imagination, and thought through education, practical reason, affiliation, access to recreation and play, because I think that's too little talked about. But women who have to do all the housework and and have an outside job too, one of the things they often lack is recreation. I talk about control over material and social environment, and also about access to a good relationship with nature and the environment. So those are the ones that I focus on, and then the emotional health is the last one that I've added, because I think that's that's something that, you know, women, even women who seem to be doing well, they've got enough money and so on, they're often living with a lot of fear and a lot of anger that's perhaps produced by the inequalities and pressures upon them. So that too seems to me to be an important indicator. And then what I think is you have to find some way of course, measuring these, and that's a challenge for partnership between philosophers and economists, but that it puts the question in the right place. It really is looking at the thing you need to look at. The Human Development Reports of the United Nations Development Program have been measuring quality of life in countries by looking at capabilities since 1990, and it's made a difference to the way politicians do things. They care now much more about education and health care because they see that they're separate from economic growth. Just raising economic indicators does not deliver a more adequate level of health care and education. So it's an approach that's having some real practical impact, and you know, the intellectual work has to keep being developed further and keep being pushed further, but now we have an international association called the Human Development and Capability Association that has 700 members from about 40 countries, and to me it's thrilling to see young people come in and, you know, contest my formulations, mix it up, have a good argument, and then also think about ways to translate this into actual policy. So it's a movement now.
Was this experience unusual in the context of your other work, in the sense that you're really going out into the field and I guess one would say doing empirical research about the ideas that you are developing? Was this a unique experience in that sense, or do you do it more often than not in your other works?
Well, you know, I think any real empirical research requires partnership with people who know how to do that. And what I did when I went out into the field was just educate myself to raise the right questions. But if I really want to know what correlations are there between, let's say, land rights and domestic violence, I'll ask somebody who does empirical research. And I've made a network of partners, and I can consult them, and that's one of the things our association is about too. But I think that's something I do also when I write about the emotions, that I'm very interested in what experimental psychology tells us about emotions. I'm very interested in what biology tells us. What I contribute is something different. In both cases, what I'm mainly contributing, I think, is a kind of thinking through, laying out systematically, offering the justifications, and so on. But no good unless you have adequate contact with the empirical stuff.
In your work in India, you come up against the importance of religion as a defining feature of the environment that makes implementation of some goals, if not impossible, then difficult. Talk about that, the insights you developed about religion and the way one had to really lay out the conflict between religious rights and this new agenda of women's rights.
Yeah, well, of course, I think it's obvious that traditional religions have given women a second-class status in pretty much every case, and it's only very recently that you have reform movements within all the major religions, really, that are trying to give women a more equal status. Now, I guess it's a cliche of feminism that religion is per se bad for women. I don't actually believe that. I think that women, you know, as religion was a source for social justice in our civil rights movement, I think it can also be a source of energy for feminists, and it has been. But I think, you know, religion is a part of culture, and all traditional cultures have been sexist, and so all traditional religions have been sexist. So I think what one has to ask is, how far do we make concessions to people who maintain sexist practices just because they cite a religious basis? So that was the question that I pose in the book. Now, I think there are two extremes that you could go to. I mean, one extreme would be to say, well, you know, we don't pay any attention to the fact that it's religion. It doesn't make any difference to us at all. I think that's wrong, because I think that very often our knowledge of religious persecution is such that we see that people very often are too inattentive to religious claims, and even when things are not, the stakes don't seem to be high for public order and other people's rights. So, for example, work days, people will work on Saturday, but they won't work on Sunday. And if somebody has a religious reason for not working on Saturday, they often have great difficulty maintaining a job, getting unemployment compensation, and so on. So I think, in those cases, the religious reason should be taken very seriously. I also think when somebody doesn't want to do military service because of a religious reason, that should be taken seriously. So, I think these claims are often very deep in people's lives, and they should be listened to. And in India, for example, the drug laws are routinely suspended for the religious holiday of Holi, because you are supposed to use marijuana and hashish on Holi. And, if it's easy to do that because Hinduism is the majority religion. But if it was some minority, like the Native Americans have had this problem in the US, well, you can bet people would say, oh, drugs, this is really terrible. So I think, these religious claims, wherever the rights of others and public order and safety are not at stake, they should be taken very seriously. So the other extreme, however, is to say that religion always trumps other concerns. And so what I try to argue in the book is that my capabilities list, which is, what I say is that a certain threshold level of these 10 capabilities on my list is essential for a life with human dignity. And if I've successfully argued that, then we certainly don't think it's a decent society unless people are allowed to have all of those, because it's been argued that that's not a life with human dignity. Well, then I would say those 10, if the argument has been well made, trump religious reasons. So, for example, any practice of child marriage, which is a great offense to women's education, to their bodily integrity, and so on, would be ruled out by that kind of principle. On the other hand, the woman chooses to wear a veil. Then the issue of choice becomes very complex, and we start having to ask about parents' rights over their children. But up to a point, I think that one can defend that practice so long as there's sufficient guarantees of education, employment options, property rights, and exit options from that religion. So those, I think, are the things that make it a choice if a woman is going to have a life of veiling. And so, this is the way I think about it, that you just look at the overall menu of the opportunities that the woman has, and if she really has the 10 capabilities on my list, and then she leads a life that we don't like because we think it's too authoritarian, she submits herself to an authoritarian religion, an authoritarian relationship, well, if the political situation that she lives in has really provided her with those 10 capabilities, which would include primary and secondary education, political rights and liberties, and health care, and so on, then I think, that's her choice. And of course, some people do choose to serve in an authoritarian group like the military, and we don't think that people who choose to be career military people are always not choosing, although of course they are too. There's an issue of economic constraint, and if they're constrained into that life because they don't have any other options, that's bad. But if they choose that life, then that's not so bad. So that's the way I think about it, and I think what I see in India is that that's basically what the women's movement is working for. They do not want to portray themselves as hostile to Hinduism, or in the case of Islam, to Islam. But in fact, women are working within these religions to achieve changes. Hindu women in India this year just succeeded in reforming the unequal property law so that women have equal shares in agricultural land, which was a big deal. And it really is highly correlated with other rights and opportunities. So, those are the sorts of things that they're working for, but they don't say we have to junk Hinduism. They just reform the Hindu property law. The difficulty doing this is that actually male clerics play a big role in society, as in every country. And so, for example, Christian women in India got the right to divorce on grounds of cruelty only in the year 2001, because the different kinds of Catholic priests and Protestant ministers and so on, they resisted change for many years. And then when they decided change might be good, then they had to all get together and agree on some formulation. And so the Protestants and the Catholics and the ones from Portugal and the ones originally from some other place, you know, they all had to get together, and it took a long time, and it's ridiculous. Actually, Christian rights of women have been particularly slow because they come from so many different religions and so many different origins. Muslim women had that right earlier. But the Muslim women have a similar problem, which is that there's a thing called the Muslim Personal Law Board, which is a bunch of unelected, self-perpetuating male clerics who decide what the rules should be, and because they're not accountable, they don't really listen enough to the voices of women. So there are these struggles in every religion, and then, of course, after that, they have to persuade Parliament to pass the right reform law, and that takes another 5 years, and so there are these problems, but I think one should not say, and I don't see women saying, that we want to just junk religion per se.
You're raising some interesting points, and there are two insights that I found in your discussion of religion that I think are useful in other areas. One is the role of power, which you were just talking about, but also the inability or incapacity to see diversity of thinking within a religion, and the two of these together can further the possibility of change, which is really important as we deal with religions that we don't understand in our involvement in the world.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think when Americans look abroad, they talk about traditions or the Indian tradition. Now, very often it's absurd, because, I mean, to even use the phrase the Indian tradition makes no sense at all, because it's such a heterogeneous country with 350 languages and so many different regional cultures and so many different religions. I mean, not just Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity, but also there are Parsis, there are Jews, so just Buddhists, Sikhs, Jains. So we then, within each of these, have diversity. And often I think people think it's a good kind of pluralistic thing to do, to say, oh, well, it's their tradition, so we mustn't criticize it. But often what that means is you're just conceding that the voices of the currently powerful men should rule, and you're not even listening to the voices of women, who probably haven't learned to read and write, and therefore they're not recorded as part of the dominant tradition. And, you know, interestingly, this is what the British did when they were ruling over India. When native Indian reformers said, you know, we don't want child marriage anymore, the British judges said, oh, but it's the Hindu tradition. Now, you know, of course, they were deferring to the powerful men in the community. Why were they doing that? Because they had the shrewd idea that if you give them that control over women, then they might be less antsy about rebelling against the British. So the man who can be a king in his house is less likely to notice that he's not a king in the rest of the world. So the British played up cultural relativism as a tool of their own power. And I think that's an example we should think about, because I think Americans sometimes make similar errors just out of naivete. They think, oh, well, the tradition of Hinduism is X, or the tradition of Islam. But all of these have had argument and debate for years. I mean, Islamic feminism in India has a very old history, and wonderful works and novels and so on written by women, and so too with Hindu feminism. I find that some, you know, do you know the recent movie Water by Deepa Mehta?
No.
Well, it's a movie made by a Canadian emigre who left India at the age of 20, and then she went to Canada. And it portrays Hinduism as monolithically terrible in its attitude toward widows. All widows have to go to this ashram and live a miserable life, and only Gandhi could save them from this terrible life. Now, in fact, Starting in the 19th century already, women themselves were taking the lead in rebelling against the treatment of widows. There were conferences on widowhood. There were women who set up schools for widows. So all of this is just left out. And so I think any account of a culture really needs to begin by listening to the voices of dissent within that and just understanding that it's always a scene of contestation. What would you expect? I mean, the family is always a scene of contestation, as we know very well. Well, why should a tradition be any different? And it isn't. It never is.
Now as you're working through these problems, you actually put on your hat as a legal philosopher, and I want you to talk a little about that, because you see the law and the principles that have evolved over time, even from different settings, as something to think about as one navigates the movement, the progressive movements of women's rights, as it comes up against the obstacles that might be in a religion. Talk a little about that, because law is central, right?
Well, feminism has always, in America and in Europe, I would say, but especially, I guess, in the U.S., it has relied on law as an avenue of social change. The first very famous legal feminist was Catherine McKinnon, but there were so many. And these women thought, well, what we really need, what we can make progress with, is better laws on rape, some laws on sexual harassment, understanding that sexual harassment is not about being sexy, but it's a practice of discrimination and subordination. All these things which were put gradually into the law, so that now the most conservative federal judge is bound to recognize that the asymmetry of power in the workplace is an ingredient of thinking about sexual harassment. So I think that's something that has really happened a lot in the U.S., and I think it's happened in part because law is a very high prestige profession. People listen to what lawyers say, and people have pretty good access to the legal system. I mean, it's not perfect. We need better public defenders and so on. But, you know, as the movie The Accused shows, where that woman who was gang raped got an adequate lawyer through the public defender system, that was a real case, and that really happened. And when my law students see it, they understand that there's something that they're involved in that is progressive and that can really change the law. That was the case that established that no means no. That if you're wearing sexy clothes and you say no, that's no. Now, I have to say that it's not the same in India. That is, in India, people think it's a little naive and starry-eyed to think that a main way of making change for women is to work on law reform in the way that I'm used to doing in the U.S. And that's partly because law is not such a respected profession nationwide, because legal change is very slow and very cumbersome, and because the access to the courts is compromised by corruption. A woman who registers a rape complaint, that case will average take 9 years to get to court. And so until you fix that, I mean, there's no point in changing the law, because the most fundamental thing is she needs to get on with her life, and so she needs prompt adjudication. So what I think is badly needed, and so, you know, I've worked with a legal non-governmental organization in India that works on feminist issues. They think, too, reform, massive reform of legal education. They would like to try to start a private law school, because the state-run ones are just very poor. They don't teach feminist approaches. They don't teach all this new stuff. The judiciary is very good nonetheless. So if you ever manage to get up to the Supreme Court and even the high courts of the states, then that's okay. And this organization that I've worked with has a wonderful woman named Indira Jaising, who's brought some extraordinary, important cases on sexual harassment before the court. But it's the lower levels where women are just floundering and doing very badly. So I think you know, one first has to have the rule of law and a smooth, efficient legal system before feminists can hope that that's the way they'll change things.
This problem of the role of religion and the role of the state, their interactions and so on, is a problem that you are grappling with now. Is that correct? And tell us a little about that research of thinking about what it is to have freedom of religion and a religious practice.
Because this is a rare case where I'm focusing on the American tradition. And I did it because after the election of 2004, I felt I wanted to make an intervention into the public debate because I think that people are increasingly polarized around religious matters, and they misunderstand often certain things about the tradition. I think religious people think that the idea of separation of church and state is an idea that means that religion is being marginalized, it's being trivialized, it's being said to be unimportant. And so what I set out to show is that there is a long tradition. You could associate it particularly with Madison, although I think it goes back further to the 17th century and Roger Williams, that says, no, the issue, the central issue is one of fairness. We want all to be citizens of equal standing in the public realm. We want not just adequate liberty, but equal liberty. Now, what that means is that any kind of religious establishment or religious orthodoxy in public life is a problem, because it jeopardizes that equal standing. Madison was thinking about a law in Virginia, which seems very benign, and it's what lots of European countries have now, which is that there would be a tax for the benefit of the Anglican Church, but if you have some other church, you could always choose to give it instead to your church. And he said, no, by making the Anglican Church the central one, this makes a statement that our society is basically an Anglican society, and other people don't enter the polity, as he put it, on equal conditions. So that line has been very important in the Supreme Court's thinking about establishment and why establishment is bad. And I think that equality line is really the one to press when we think about why school prayer might be bad. It's not like we think, oh, children are contaminated by prayer, but it's just that any prayer you choose is going to include some and exclude others. It's going to, I mean, one of the landmark cases was a young boy in Pennsylvania who decided on the day of required Bible reading that he was going to bring in a copy of the Quran, and he read from the Quran. Well, he got sent to the principal's office, and his principal took out after him, wrote to every college he'd ever applied to, and said not to admit this.
This is a recent case.
This was 1960s. It was Abington versus Schempp. It was this kid, Ellery Schempp, who's now a distinguished physicist, and he's, you know, obviously a brilliant kid. It's one of the rare cases where the kid actually brought the case. The parents were only kind of helping him out. But he sent $10 to the ACLU, and he said, will you take my case? And they did. And what emerged from that was that, of course, the public schools, they thought that they were being neutral, but that they were really Protestant schools. They were choosing, of course, the King James Bible, not the Catholic Bible. And in his case, they just, the Quran just filled them with horror. There were no Muslims. He wasn't a Muslim. He was just trying to make a point about pluralism. And so the point is that any kind of religious observance you choose is always going to be somebody's and not somebody else's, and fair to some and excluding of others. And I want people to, you know, think about that and what that implies. And if we want to separate religion from the public realm, it's not because we hate religion or because we think that it doesn't belong in human life. It's because it just can't be done in a way that's fair to all and gives all equal liberty. Now, I think that also means that we shouldn't impose special burdens on religion. I mean, for example, suppose we had a situation in which the public sewer system didn't serve the churches, and the fire department wouldn't come to put out a fire in a church. Now, you might think separation of church and state requires that situation, right? Because we want the state is the fire department, and here's the church. Well, then they shouldn't be mixed. But see, that's why I think separation is not a very helpful idea, but equality is a much more helpful idea. And, well, what we can see is it just would not be fair to religious people if they didn't get these basic life protections of the sewer system and the fire department. Now then, of course, there's a lot of gray area in the middle. Do they get transportation to parochial schools on the public buses? You know, all these things are very contested, but I think that when we think about them, the right way of thinking about it is we don't want to have a state that burdens religion in a way that the non-religious are not burdened. We also don't want to have a state that favors religion or any particular religion. So that's the line, and I mean it's a line that the court, the mainstream, the kind of center of the Supreme Court has been pushing for a long time, but you know, these things change, and I think right now it is in jeopardy, and so I think it's a time to reaffirm the tremendous importance of that equal status idea.
Your career, just the little bits that we've talked about, really strike me as offering us a lot of thought about how students might train for the future. The kinds of curriculum, the kinds of worldviews that they should have. I know you've worked a lot on this. I actually have that that book here, Cultivating Humanity, A Classical Defense of Reform in Liberal Education. Talk a little about that. I mean, we, you know, in the brief time we have, we can't cover what all the cover, but what are the central features, do you think, of an adequate preparation for a future that reflects both this insights that you've offered us about, you know, those things that emerge out of the American tradition, but also sensitive to the very great diversity out there in the world?
Yeah, well, this is a book about higher education in America, and it's about the liberal education part of it, which is something that I think we're lucky to have that, because most nations don't have that in their university system. They just go in and they're studying one thing. But we have an opportunity where, at an age where young people are already pretty independent and pretty sophisticated, to give them a general preparation for citizenship and life. So my question was, focusing now on the role of the humanities and the social sciences, because I think other people can talk better than I can about the science part, what should that involve? And I argued that there were three abilities, above all, that we need to cultivate to be adequate citizens of this very interlocking and complicated world. And the first is the Socratic one, the ability to examine your own beliefs and just ask, what are your reasons for believing what you believe? And I want to say that that's essential for a reasoned public culture, for a culture where it's not just sound bites on talk radio, but it's really serious deliberation and reasoned debate. Then, learning about other countries. So the whole part, I call the citizen of the world part, means a lot more knowledge than people used to get, than I got, about non-Western cultures. I want to include in that the knowledge of at least one foreign language, because I think even if it's, let's say, French or Italian, you still learn something from that about how another group of people sees the world and how difficult it is to translate that so neatly into your own language. But I also think you need to learn about minorities in your own country, so I devote some time to women's studies, African American studies, studies of human sexuality. Then the third one, which goes closely with the second, is the cultivation of the imagination. You know, I think it's not enough, although you have to do it, to learn historical facts and facts about economics, but you need to be able to think what it might be like to be in a position different from your own, so that the arts, not just literature, but also drama, also dance, music. These have a big role to play in cultivating the sort of person who's prepared to go out into the world and think well about these problems. Now, I did this for higher education simply because that was what I knew, and there were all these debates raging at the time about it. But now I feel I want to return to it again and write something about earlier education, because I feel that these things are increasingly in jeopardy all over the world, the things I care about, because people are so eager for success in the global market that they want kids to learn what will enrich the nation. And everyone is talking about technology education now and science education. I don't think these are bad things, but I think they're just not sufficient. And certainly in India it's gone very, very far. So parents will, their glory will be if their child gets into the Indian Institute of Technology and Management, they'll be ashamed to have a child who's an artist or a writer or a humanist. And that part, even the critical thinking part, is sorely lacking because kids are being stuffed with all the things they need to pass these exams and not taught to think for themselves. I think in the U.S., this is happening. I mean, when we hear all kinds of people in our leadership talking about education, and certainly preparing reports about it, it's all about science and technology, nothing about humanities and arts. So I'm getting more and more into this, and the Association of American Colleges and Universities has produced a very good report that I've been kind of advising on about the complex set of skills that kids really do need, and of course they're focused on higher education too, but it has to begin earlier if people are to be adequate citizens by the time they get to college. So this is an important thing to harp on, and I'm getting more and more worried that we're going to have nations of docile engineers who won't know how to examine the claims of a political leader. In India, the state that has particularly gone down this road is the state of Gujarat, where kids for generations now have not learned much critical thinking, and they're stuffed with this rote learning. And that is the state that's had the largest amount of religious violence. There's no public criticism, or not enough, in the state, that is, of the leadership, although plenty of criticism from outside and national media. But, I think the education system is part of the problem, that people have to learn to be critical and to do it respectfully and publicly, and only then will we have the kind of journalism and the kind of political culture that we really need.
One final question. You have assumed a role as a public intellectual, and one has to comment on the poor state of that role in our country today, which then affects our public debate on global issues. It affects our debate on education and so on. You're unique in the sense that you still bring the thoughtful reasoning that you employ in your field. Talk a little about that. What can we do about that public discourse? Is it training people more in philosophical ways of thinking and introducing a program like you've just described? What can make the difference so we elevate the discourse?
I think it's very, very difficult in this country. I think the first thing we ought to notice is that we're pretty isolated in this regard. I've just come back from Holland, and in Holland, philosophy is big news in the popular culture. There's a popular magazine, Philosophy, that presents accounts of issues for the general public. It's not a gossip column magazine. And, if you give a lecture, I gave the Dutch translation of one of my books, and of course the very fact that a book of philosophy would be translated into Dutch when anyone who is an academic reads English is itself quite interesting. Well, people are all coming to these lectures. They want to know about the philosophical issues. So my belief is that human beings are not that different from one country to the other. Issues about grief and mourning, issues about social justice, these are issues that people really care about. And in America, they just don't get the access to discussion about these issues because the media have decided that that just isn't interesting. Now, why is that? Now, I think part of it is the increasing corporate control of the media. The fact is that even when they want to do something more in the public interest, CBS is owned by Viacom, et cetera, et cetera. So you get all of this top-down control, which produces focus on short-term profit and therefore on sensationalism. I think, major national newspapers have certainly gotten worse. I think the New York Times Book Review and the New York Times op-ed page have gotten measurably worse in the last couple of years. The Post is much better, but that's always been America focused, so it's not one of my main venues. So I find that, it's through the book review only that you can get out to the general public, and even there, the New Republic, which has a brilliant literary editor, he has fewer pages now because of financial issues than he had before. So where can one get access to this public? I think if young people thought that there was a way that they could get their thoughts about issues into print, I mean, my graduate students would work much more on that. But since it's so hard, then they have almost an incentive not to do it, because it also jeopardizes their career in philosophy. I'm the chair of the Committee on Public Philosophy in the American Philosophical Association, and I know that there's tremendous passion for these things, and there are a lot of good efforts at the community level going on that we don't hear about. There are a lot of, philosophy cafes, public discussions, local newspapers, local TV. And then, of course, there are people like you who do things that have a larger audience. And I would also mention the show Philosophy Talk that John Perry and Ken Taylor do out of Stanford. I think that's a wonderful program. And so there are rays of hope. But it is so much easier for me to talk to the press in India, in Holland, in Italy, in Germany, than it is in my own country, and I think that's pretty weird. And we are a nation that has always had suspicion of intellectuals, and that's part of it. But I think the media are to blame.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, we hope that more people will read what you have written, and we hope to have you back at Berkeley to give another lecture, and at that time we'll do another interview and talk about another dimension of your work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.